This new major superpower threatens to end the US dollar and threatens to end the US global supremacy. The US right now and the West is becoming very, very complacent. They're becoming very prideful, and we all know pride comes before the fall. So this new global league is rising up in the shadows, and nobody's prepared for when it's going to take over. So everyone, what is this new superpower that's rising up? How did they get here? And what are the latest new developments that they're doing that's about to shock the world? Well, everyone, that's exactly what I'm going to go over in today's video. So let's not waste any time, ladies and gentlemen. Let's get straight into the news, the facts, and the data. Okay, now first things first, what we're going to talk about in today's video is BRICS. But there's been some new, huge, massive developments with the BRICS nations, and dozens of countries are stampeding to get in. So look at this headline, everyone: how BRICS became a real club and why others want in. So BRIC was coined in 2001 by economist Jim O'Neill, then at Goldman Sachs Group Inc., to draw attention to strong growth rates in Brazil, Russia, India, and China. It was intended as an optimistic thesis for investors amid market pessimism following the terrorist attacks in the US on September 11th. The four nations took the idea and ran with it. Their rapid growth at the time meant they had shared interests and common challenges. They were already cooperating in forums like the World Trade Organization and felt their influence in a US-dominated world order would be greater if their voices were combined. The first meeting of the BRIC Foreign Ministry was organized by Russia on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly in 2006. The group held its first Leaders Summit in 2009. South Africa was invited to join at the end of 2010, extending membership to another continent. So this has been going on for a while, everyone, but unlike when it started in 2001 and it didn't have much global influence at all, the global influence is rapidly rising. Like the article said, their first meeting took place in 2006, their summit took place in 2009, and South Africa joined in 2010. But now the trend is accelerating. So look at this chart, everyone. The group accounts for more of the global economy led by China's growth. So we can see here, every single year, their share of global growth has gone from around 10% all the way up to 25%. And this is data up to 2021. You better believe it's even higher now. But I know what you're thinking, well, okay, what does BRICS actually do? Well, the biggest concrete achievements have been financial. The country agreed to pool 100 billion of foreign currency, which they can lend to each other during emergencies. That liquidity facility became operational in 2016. They founded the new developmental bank, a World Bank-inspired institution that has approved more than 30 billion of loans for projects like water and transport and infrastructure since it began operations in 2015. South Africa borrowed 1 billion in 2020 to fight the pandemic, and they plan to discuss the feasibility of a common BRICS currency this year. Now, this is one of the new developments that a lot of people are starting to, wake up and pay attention to. The BRICS nations know that the US dollar is losing its global influence and its global supremacy. The US dollar share of foreign currency reserves is falling every single year and has fallen down to just 58%. And like all world reserve currencies, they always fail when the country and the empire begins to fall. And that's what we're starting to see. A lot of these nations do not take the US as serious as they did. They're not as scared as the US as they were before, and they're getting more and more powerful. So economically, Brazil and Russia's natural resources and farm products make them natural partners for Chinese demand. India and China have had weaker trade connections with each other, partly due to political rivalries and a border dispute. That's a dynamic I'm very interested to see how it plays out, with China and India working together in this BRICS league. We all know they don't get along. There's a huge border dispute with China and India. They're two rising superpowers, with China well ahead, but India is rapidly catching up, and India has a much younger population. So you may be wondering, well, okay, who's in charge of this new superpower? Well, economically, China's gross domestic product is more than twice the size of all four other members combined. In theory, that should give it the most sway. In practice, India, which recently surpassed China in population, has been a counterweight. To take the two example, BRICS has not formally endorsed China's big development push called the Belt and Road Initiative, partly because India objects to the Belt Road infrastructure projects in Pakistan, its neighbor and arch rival. So that's right, everyone. China has a huge dominance on all other BRICS nations. Right now, they are still pretty much in charge, but India is rapidly rising up to rival China. On the new development bank, there's no dominant shareholder. Beijing agreed to equal holdings advocated by New Delhi. The bank is headquartered in Shanghai, but it has been led by an Indian and now Brazil's former president, Dilma Rousseff. Again, we can see another chart here, everyone. The BRICS share of total market capitalization among emerging markets. We can see here the black is China, the pink India, blue Brazil, yellow Russia, and the green South Africa. But people, what's the most important new trend, what's happening with BRICS, is how many nations are trying to get in right now. So who wants to join and why? Well, China has been seeking to raise its profile on the global stage and counter Western influence. Initiated the conversation about expansion when it chaired the group last year, triggering concern among other members that their own influence could be diluted. The proposal will be a main focus at this year's summit, according to Enel Suklal, ambassador from South Africa, which is sharing. But listen to this. At least 19 countries have expressed an interest, and of those, 13 have formally asked to join, including Saudi Arabia and Iran, he said in an interview. Others that have expressed interest include Argentina, United Arab Emirates, Algeria, Egypt, Bahrain, Indonesia, along with 2 nations from East Africa and 1 from West Africa that Suklu didn't identify. So this is absolutely massive for BRICS, because if they do get more nations joining in, this is going to massively increase their diplomatic influence and global trade lucrative deals. And what one of those biggest deals could be would be a deal with Saudi Arabia, someone that's been a huge partner to the US to provide cheap oil for them. Well, now Saudi Arabia, we've got some new breaking news. They're starting to turn away from the US and now starting to embrace the BRICS nations. So look at this, everyone. Thanks to sanctions, the US is losing its grip on the Middle East. Last Friday, members of the Arab League welcomed the Syrian regime back to the organization, and representatives from several Arab member states shook Syrian leaders Assad's hand and gave him a warm reception, according to several news outlets. So this represents a reversal from years of isolation placed on the regime and a break with US policy, which remains staunchly opposed to Assad. The League's approach with Assad should be seen as a repudiation of US policy, and especially a sign of how Washington's influence among other League members, the most powerful of which Saudi Arabia and Egypt, has waned. So this is absolutely massive, everyone. The Middle East holds a lot of oil. The only reason why there's so much demand for the US dollar is because all oil has to be sold in US dollars. But if this comes to an end, if they start trading in other currencies, we're going to see the US dollar collapse. In both cases, we find regimes that Washington has sought to isolate and sanction, but both states have been instead expanding their relations with other states in the region with the help of China. Meanwhile, both Beijing and Riyadh have increased their ties with Russia. These developments help illustrate how growing US attempts to impose or threaten to impose hardline sanctions against a growing number of regimes has only accelerated a global movement away from the US dollar and away from Washington's orbit. So that's another thing, everyone. A lot of these countries have been pushed around by America. They've been pushed around by Washington, and they're saying enough is enough. They're now seeing weakness in the US, especially with the huge mess that was leaving Iraq, and now they're starting to think that this is their time to shine. But one of the most alarming news coming out of this is Saudi Arabia's increasing ties with Iran and Syria. In March of this year, Saudi Arabia and Iran announced a resumption of relations following a deal brokered by China. The Saudi regime, a longtime Washington ally, had apparently not told the Biden administration of the meetings with Iran and China. Shortly after the agreement was announced, the administration dispatched CIA Director William Burns to Saudi Arabia, where he reportedly expressed frustration with the Saudis, telling Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman that the US has felt blindsided by Riyadh's rapprochement with Iran and Syria. Wow, everyone, it looks like the US foreign policy isn't going good right now. But that's not all, everyone. They're also increasing their ties with Russia. New overtures by the Saudis toward both Syria and Iran also ran afoul of Washington, because both Iran and Syria are important allies of Moscow. With the US now inflicting harsh restrictions on the Russian regime, anything that helps Damascus and Tehran has potential to help Moscow as well. Both the Saudis and the Chinese have shown growing efforts to forge ties directly with Russia regime as well. At a Chinese-Russian summit in February 2022, both regimes stated they plan to forge even closer ties. This apparently has not changed even after a year of heightened hostilities from the US and NATO aimed at Moscow. In fact, it is likely that Russia-China relations are closer than they've ever been in a post-Soviet era. This has clearly become a problem for Washington, as China continues to provide an important market for Russia exports in the face of US sanctions. Both states have also made efforts to move away from the US dollar and settle international trade in other currencies. So this isn't good, everyone. You have China teaming up Russia, and Saudis to do huge global trade together. This means in the future, if the US and other NATO allies try to put sanctions on other countries, it's not going to work. But the Saudis and Russia just made a huge deal. The Saudi regime has grown closer to Moscow in the wake of US sanctions against Russia. For example, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, traditional Middle Eastern allies of the United States, are not shying away from importing, storing, trading, or re-exporting Russia fuels despite Americans' efforts to persuade them to join a crackdown on Russia's attempts to evade the Western sanctions on its oil. So what's actually happening, everyone, how Russia's getting away from these sanctions, they're either selling oil to Saudi Arabia or sending their oil there so they can store it and trade it as well. And OPEC is now joining in on the action. This can be seen, in fact, the organization of the petroleum exporting countries, OPEC, which is dominated by its largest producer, Saudi Arabia, has shown no interest in helping the US in its sanctions against its war of Russia. Instead, OPEC has cut production levels to raise oil prices, which benefits Moscow. The US has opposed these cuts, and now some anti-Russian factions in the US are exploring ways to punish OPEC for its lack of enthusiasm in cooperating with US efforts against Russia. So a new trend is clearly emerging, everyone, as America tries to put more and more sanctions on other countries that don't play ball. Fewer countries are saying they're interested and they're not playing along. Indeed, the spread of US sanctions provide good reason for other regimes to increase efforts to forge close ties with other regimes as insurance against becoming the victims of a US policy. After all, the US has been quite free and easy with threatening uncooperative countries with so-called secondary sanctions as punishment for doing business with states like Syria and Russia. The United States is ramping up efforts to choke off Russia's economy and has set its sights on the Middle East. A top US Treasury official arrived in the United Arab Emirates, UAE, on Monday to warn the region business hub that helping Moscow evade sanctions wouldn't be without consequences, and China had already been warned in a similar fashion. But while Washington's pursuing a divide and conquer strategy in the Middle East, China is starting to broker more and more deals. While the US ratchets up efforts to isolate its many enemies, the Chinese, the Saudis, the Arab League, and OPEC all shrug and look to increasing international communication and trade. The Washington's foreign policy establishment shows few signs that it's even noticing. The US foreign policy toolbox continues to be centered on sanctions, violence, and making demands both on its allies and professional enemies. The rest of the world is moving on, however, and Washington may be among the last to accept the new reality. So everyone, I know what you're thinking, well, okay, what does this all mean for you in simple terms? Well, what this means is the US is losing its global supremacy and global influence. More and more nations are continuing to rise up to rival the US, and this is mean there's going to be increasingly huge geopolitical risks, and why you want to diversify your investments, not all have your money in US denominated assets like stocks, for example. You want to have things like gold, silver, cryptocurrency, so it doesn't matter if the US does lose its world reserve currency status or whatever new currency replaces it, it will always hold value in whatever currency. But everyone, what do you think about all of this? Let me know down below. Now, for my loyal viewers and subscribers still watching, you're awesome. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all in the next video.